thank you so much to Philip and David for uh, taking time out of their busy schedules and sharing some of their new research and expertise with us. This is the New Technologies in Soil Survey webinar. It's a multi-module series. We are on module 2, the mesoscale, working at the catchment watershed landscape level. We'll be moving on to continental pedology in the next one in the coming weeks, coming months, I should say. And so we'll have about 30 minutes for talking and then for presentations, and then about 10 to 15 for Q&A thereafter. There's a little Q&A spot on the top right of your screen if you want to put your questions in there, or you can raise your hand with the little hand logo up there, and I will try to help our presenters out with fielding those questions and also be keeping time. We're planning on ending at 3 today. And so our first presenter, Phillip Owens, will be presenting for us today. So if you want to introduce yourself a little bit and take over, that'd be great.
Got it. Let me know
Meyer,
when you
while that's coming up there. Oh, sorry, Philip.
Okay.
I put some links to the stuff that has happened previously for this group and the registration for the next webinar. And we have a couple more planned for DSP for soil health and MIR that will be coming soon. So keep a lookout for that. So take it away, Philip.
Okay. Thank you, Sky. It's great to be here and great to be with the NRCS Soil Survey. I got my start as a soil scientist trainee, mapping in Nacogdoches, Texas. And then soil judging, worked for 2 university cooperators, Moy Rutledge and Larry Wilding, and was eventually the university cooperator at Purdue University before I switched over to ARS. And I'm currently the acting associate area director for the Southeast area with office in Stoneville, Mississippi. But I'm still the research leader and research soil scientist at the Del Bumper Small Farms Research Center in Booneville, Arkansas. And you guys understand how crazy 25 was. I was volunteered to be a associate area director for 3 weeks. And during that 3 weeks, the associate area director was on vacation. He took the DRP, so they asked me if I'd stay till August. I did, and they said, "Man, the closeout for the end of the fiscal year is so bad. Will you stay till the end of the fiscal year?" And then we shut down. And then they said, "Why not stay till the end of the year, calendar year?" So I did that. The area director retired, and they said, "We're shorthanded. Can you stay?" And I said, "How long?" And they said, "We'll let you know." So I don't know how long I'll be doing this, but I've been away from research since April, where I'm basically just attending meetings for my team. My team is Dr. Zamir Lubahova, Dr. Edwin Winsler, Dr. Joshua Blackstock, and Marcelo Mancini. And I think that this may be the largest group of pedologists within the ARS that's under one roof. So I appreciate those guys for continuing to make progress. And we want to talk about some of the new things that we've been trying that is, I feel like, attacking that landscape scale pedology. And we're really focused on trying to quantify some of the pedogenesis, if we can. Trying to switch my slides here. If that something's hung up. Okay, so everything we do, we want it to be rooted in the fundamentals of pedology. You guys all know the state model with Yenny proposed in 41. And before, when I'd approached it from the digital soil mapping perspective of trying to aggregate 4 factors and solve for relief and let relief through terrain attributes predict the patterns that we're seeing on landscapes. And I think the whole community has been fairly successful at doing that and making some progress with using terrain attributes for soil mapping. But I really always think about Milne too, trying to identify these patterns. And again, to me, water is really driving, it's the energy in the system that's driving the differentiation of a parent material to give us the soil properties and the soil patterns. And so that's always been fundamental with me, and through my training as a pedologist from Wilding and Rutledge and Jimmy Richardson and Ed Runge, Don Franzmeyer, all the giants that came before us. They understood this, and I think it's our job to try to further advance it and quantify it. Technology has always changed, and we, going from the just digging a pit and looking, we've got new sensors and new ways to go about that. And what we're going to show today is really another potential tool that we can add to our knife, tape measure, and sharpshooter. So we thinking about the Yenny's model, this temporal dimension and time, which I think in the past it's complex to think about time and actually quantify time, and how we can use that factor to help identify soils. So I'm going to show two different approaches that we're using. One's basically a remote sensing approach, and then one of them is a physically distributed hydrology model approach. And thinking about the temporal dynamics from the remote sensing, you can see differences in wetting and drying. If you look at time series remote sensing, you'll see vegetation differences, snow dynamics. And with the DHSVM, the distributed hydrology soil vegetation model, is developed at NNL at University of Washington. We're using that to try to get the 3 dimensions of the soil as well as the fourth over time. And we've also explored another models developed in England, Shetran, and we sent Edwin Winsler to England to work with the developer of this model for a year. And we're making some progress on looking at this. It's very, very similar to DHSVM and a little bit more user-friendly. And I would say that this modeling is challenging from the programming side. The DHSVM is Linux-based and extremely challenging. So make good friends with some programmers if you want to go forward, because that really does help move you along. So talking about the remote sensing, it was a few years ago, I was asked to make a high-resolution map of a USDA ARS research farm near Stoneville, Mississippi. And so I went over there with the Giddings probe and identified some places that should have some differences in soils, and sampled about 20-something sites. And then on the last day, someone told me that there was a little soil testing lab that was a mile down the road that had done some sampling out there before. So I thought, that could help with the data if I could add to it. And I went in there, and the guy said, "Oh yeah, you're talking about that old BASF farm." He said, I did quarter-acre grid on that thing. I got 2,100 samples. And I said, "Man, I'd love to have that." He said, "Well, give me your thumb drive." So I gave it to him, and we did some really cool stuff with that much data. One thing that's not presented today, but is in some of our publications, is we wanted to identify how many samples would it take to equal the 2,100 that was taken. And we came up with about 100. If you include some explanatory variables, you could get it down to 100 samples to equal 2,100 samples. So that'd be a huge cost saving to farmers. And I think one thing as pedologists that I know the precision ag community and some other communities are wanting, and that we could do a better job on, is where do you sample your soils to get a representative for a population that you could manage and manage differently and represent that population. So we started working on that a little bit. But on the spatial and temporal variance, we were looking at, the conversation started was we wanted to map, we wanted to use some remote sensing, and we were looking at, well, if you have this bare soil reflectance, you could really see some patterns. And if you have the vegetation, you see some patterns. And we said, well, let's look at it across the whole year. And we'll, on every cloud-free day, look at the remote sensing and see if we can look at the change in the image over time to help discriminate where soil populations would be different. You're obviously still going to have to go sample, but that helps you focus your time and energy and efforts to sample areas where you would most likely find different soils, at least at the surface. These images are telling us about the texture, the drainage, water holding capacity, organic matter, and then it helps us understand more about the precision ag, which is the direction that we're focused on to try to understand some of these functional differences in the soil. So what we saw across years, we were looking at every 5 days, and we were looking at the changes in each image over time to see differences in which pixels would say dry faster, which one would stay darker longer. And so all these changes are letting us know that the soil is definitely functioning different. And so that would be a good place, if you're mapping, to focus your efforts so you could capture that variability on these alluvial systems. And I'm primarily talking about alluvial systems here because those are some of the most difficult to map, because traditionally when you're in some areas with relief, that we can rely on relief a whole lot to tell us how to map soils and how soils are varying. But when you're in the alluvial system, it's the depositional differences that are causing the changes depending on where the river was at the time of the deposition, and the energy of that river dropping different size particles, and that particle size is driving a lot of the differences that we're seeing. So we aggregated all these time series satellite images and looked at some statistics for each pixel, looked at these median values and central tendencies, and some of the other statistical parameters to identify what's the where we saw statistically different values, so that we could say this is part of, these two are different, and then begin aggregating those. And then we did use some LiDAR, and it does help as well. So that was incorporated with the remotely sensed reflectance data. And and when we looked at the values that we had from when we sampled, we found that truly this process of looking at the combination of elevation and with LiDAR and the time series change helped us identify truly different populations of soils. And then I'm going to switch gears real fast from the remotely sensed work that we had done to this DHSVM model. So this idea came in 2013. Zamir and I were at the International Soil Science meeting in Jeju, and I'd been through about 10 presentations of watching and observing and thinking about these these terrain analysis or terrain derivatives were really primarily in every presentation and had some explanatory power. And I was thinking about what fundamentally what's driving these terrain signals is the water differences. And so Zamir had ran this DHSVM model for his dissertation. And one thing that stuck with me that we didn't use in the dissertation, because we weren't thinking like that at that point, was that model as an output provided soil moisture predictions for each pixel over every hour of the time we were looking at it. And so this data that the hydrologists are throwing away because they're really looking for stream dynamics and runoff events is something that I felt like is extremely valuable to us as soil scientists, because understanding this moisture is driving pedogenesis to some degree, because water is the universal solvent, so it promotes or restricts chemical reactions. It also drives the biology, and the biology is also contributing to some of the changes that we see in soils. And so we thought about it for a long time, and finally got the funding and the money and the time to focus on developing this SVM model for this intended purpose. And so we teamed up with the University of Texas Arlington Mathematics Department, got some programmers on it, and really got the model running very well. And I'll show you some of the output that we've got so far. But just a description of the model. It was developed in the 1990s by Pacific Northwest National Lab at the University of Washington. It's fully distributed, which means that it goes through multiple iterations before it gets to a predicted value of moisture, because it looks at the surrounding pixels and adjusts and adjusts and adjusts and adjusts until it says, oh, here's your prediction. And so the beautiful thing about the model is that you could set the time scale, and we're working on it now. We're working on daily predictions rather than hourly predictions, because one problem with the output is it's just a ton of information and or data, and to turn that into information is a challenge. And so the less that we had to look at and try to analyze, the better, when we felt like it was still representing what would be important for us as pedologists. But the model's open source. The pixel resolution is the resolution of the digital elevation model you're using. You can go, we're typically running it at 10 to 20 pixels, meter pixels, but it can go lower, but that just drives up the computational power needed. So we stick with 10. It can do hourly to daily resolution time-wise. And it will go across multiple years. And one of the things I think could be very important for us when we start really digging into quantifying some pedogenesis is you can backcast for 1,000 years and see how many pore volumes of water went through the soil, or how many runoff events would you have, and what strength are those runoff events. So thinking about erosion, thinking about translocations of clays, and with these movements of or differences in pore volumes could help elucidate some of the pedogenesis that we're likely to see. But the model was developed for looking at climate change and land use change, forest management practices, flooding, some glacier dynamics, stream temperature, stream quality. But the beauty is that we're taking the hydrologist trash and repurposing it for pedologist uses. And so the inputs for the model are really the factors of soil formation. You need climate data, which is precipitation, humidity, air temps, wind speeds, shortwave radiation. The vegetation that is needed can come from land use data, and land use data or remotely sensed data. The topography or relief is the DEM, and then we have to add the stream networks, and there's usually available information on stream networks. And the parent material, we envision that when you would use this, you would really need to somehow incorporate the parent material changes that are known, because that parent material really would affect the lateral hydraulic conductivity, infiltration, some surface albedo, and some of the other just fundamental properties. So I think that we would definitely need some representation of the parent material changes. And so once we get the input parameters, put it in the configuration file, and then part of the output is the stream flow. You can look at the ET, the surface runoff, which I think is important for us to understand pedogenesis. The soil moisture, again, water being driving biology, and the universal solvent can help us understand some of the reactions that if we link with the chemist, that can help understand how some things are happening in the soil. And then the water table depth, which is very useful for many uses for planners and managers. So this is kind of what a typical landscape would look like. It's gridded, and then each grid has the properties from the file associated with that grid. And then once you run the model, it predicts the moisture at multiple depths. And so you get basically a 3D image or 3D data of each pixel over time. So it's getting into the fourth dimension of understanding soils. We have a couple of papers that have been published in Geoderma on this model. If you want to get into it a little deeper, you can look at the papers and understand what we did and some of the output that we got. But we ran for those papers. They're from a study that was done we started it in 2006 in Southern Indiana. And that was when I was a university cooperator, and this is all soil survey dollars that were utilized to understand Katina within that. It was part of the Shawnee Hills, which Sam Indurante started. We were one of the 3 locations within the Shawnee Hills. And so we were looking at lust differences and the impact of lust caps over and how we could expand that understanding to the Katina concept to relate to the series that would be mapped in those locations. And so we had flumes, set up flumes in the area, moisture sensors, wells and piezometers, and then we did lots of sampling on that site. And so that's the location where the study took place. And so we have completed we had to put together the time series of meteorological variables, and we had the saturated hydraulic conductivity was measured at each depth by Phil Schoenberger. His constant head permeameter, the Moose meter. Well, lab data from the soil characterization lab. We had detailed pit description. And so we ran the DHFM model first with just the default assumptions. And then we looked at the output of the model, and the default assumptions were not good enough. And so we had you could just tell from being at pedologists places where it said the water table was not present where you would understand that it would be, and places where it wasn't that you thought, well, we better have a look at that. So we readjusted some of the default parameters with some of the data that we actually had, and got our output, which was daily output of soil moisture at 3 depths, the water table depth, and then we were looking at these. We started wanting to cluster this information so that we could look at soil variability, potentially soil function, and that was when we ran into another problem of trying to cluster time series data, and that is another super difficult challenge. So we got with the ARS statistician Quentin Reed, and he had a method of dynamic time warping where you can start seeing how individual pixels would relate to each other. And this is kind of what the output looks like. If you visualize it, you can see the map in the middle, and then the data on the right with the precipitation and the predicted water volume content. And so understanding that, we want to group that information into clusters, which is, again, very challenging. And so this is just a graphical of the summit with the dark line being the model. And this is related to the sensors and the well data in the gray, and then the precipitation is in the blue. And in some cases, like on the summit, we saw really, really good relationships. Side slopes, a lot more variability on the side slopes, which again would make sense. A little bit harder to predict because of the amount of times the water table would come up and down, capturing that variability. Excuse me. And then the toe slope again had some issues, but trends are very similar, but the actual values are a little more challenging to get it to match the sensors. But it does make us wonder about the sensors as well. I mean, what's the real number? And so with a sensor, you're looking at an area of a centimeter or so, and that's representing what we're seeing and predicting. But we have to go with some ground truthing, and sensors is what we've tagged it to, and looking at trying to correlate the sensors versus a model prediction. And this is the time warping, a schematic of the time warping classification. And it looks at the optimal match of the data. It's unsupervised, and it's looking at, does the pixel here and the pixel here have the same time series responses? And so if they respond the same, then you can say, yes, those two pixels would fit within the cluster. And at some point, you'll get to where the pixels do not correspond the same, and so then that will be a different cluster. And looking at the silhouette scores from the dynamic time warping, we saw some good relationships. Definitely it's more in the autumn, we saw good relationships. The winter, we did not see as good relationships. And also summer was not as good. But this is just a visual of what those clusters look like from the dynamic time warping statistics. The black line was the soil survey mapping unit delineations, and then there were 3 different clusters that dynamic time warping predicted. There's the blue area is where the little stream went through at the bottom there, and so we were looking at it from 0 to 20, 20 to 45, 45 to 60 centimeters. And then we also looked at the water table depth. And so this was done between October of 2008 and September of 2009. We did the clustering based off these daily temporal resolution. And we looked at it seasonally too. The silhouette score, again, measures how well defined the clusters are, and the ranges from -1 to 1, and larger values indicate the clusters are more separate. So the temporal dynamics of the model predict, and when you look at the traditional mapping, it's kind of 2 to 3, second and third dimension. They're looking at soil processes with depth inferred by the polygons. And with the digital soil mapping, which is kind of the state of the art now, uses multiple different methods to predict continuous maps. And it does elucidate soil processes with depth, but inferred by the surface grids. And we're really trying to get to this 4-dimensional mapping with these distributed models to try to see changes over time, both longer periods of time and short-term time. And our focus is really on understanding soil differences and clusters to inform precision management. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But just to conclude the DHSVM study, it did provide meaningful soil similarity clusters. And so I thought that was positive. The clusters were related to the soil moisture from the sensors. Again, were some issues, and we're continuing to refine it. We're currently working with the University of Texas Arlington doing some sensitivity analysis, and to try to understand what are the properties that are most influential to the prediction. And again, I didn't go into this very much, but we're really looking at asking a question about, do these clusters help us identify places where we observed phagic properties? If you'll remember Don Frensmeyer's conceptual model of less than 15% slope, a restrictive layer within a meter, less thickness of 50 centimeters, and historically forested vegetation. And we had very, very strong predictions correlated with what Frensmeyer's model was. So I think in some cases this could be used to verify that. The soil moisture was estimated and positively related to the measured soil moisture. overall. There, as I said, there are some cases where there's a little bit more work to be done. And we think that soils can be mapped in clusters in terms of their physical response to variable moisture, and as definitely related to topographic position, and the clusters can relate to observable soil characteristics and definitely moisture dynamics and long-term properties. So just thinking before I wrap it up, how can we use this data? And one case I think for sure is we could help validate areas where oxyaquic, since we can't rely on any real pedological features. It's an assumption, and I think we could put some numbers to that and potentially validate the oxyaquic moisture regime. I think we could potentially use it for better delineation of soil moisture regimes. Definitely determine periods and depths of seasonal water table, which is extremely important, certainly for septic systems, for management of crops, many uses for that. I think there's a potential for better recommendations for soil health management, because the moisture in the water is really driving the biology, and the biology is extremely important in soil health. So we could get a better approach to providing recommendations for managers for soil health management. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is trying to provide better nutrient use related to water, because you can have a soil that is optimum fertilization, and as soon as it runs out of water, the nutrients are not utilized. And if we could somehow match that nutrient use to the predicted water availability in dryland agriculture, I think we could start dialing in exactly what is the fertilizer response that you could likely expect in a grain yield given this much water is available. We hope the next generation can use something like this or a tool like this to help quantify Yenny's model. And then I think for the soil survey, we could provide some alternative map products and think about how to group the data to answer different types of questions. If you have any questions, you can contact me. Zamir and I are leading a national effort for a new process with USDA ARS, and we are in charge of precision management. And so we are building multiple teams of folks to attack different questions related to precision management for precision ag. And you don't have to be an ARS to be on the team. We're involving universities, stakeholders, and certainly you're welcome to join us if you want. And if you'd like to, just send us an email. Okay, with that, I will stop sharing. I can figure out how. There we go. Are there any questions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Phillip. Excellent presentation. If you want to raise your hand and then we can call on you, you can flip on your mic and ask Phillip personally, or you can put one in the Q&A and we can field them from there. So.
I will say one thing to add to it is this modeling is pretty, it is difficult. So I think that going forward, until we are working on ways to use artificial intelligence to operationalize this, where you won't have to, go through the labor of getting your data files together and running a highly computational demanding model every time. So I think that we can get it in the future to be more easily accessible. But I do think there are potentially other models that could be used that are like the Sheetran is much more user friendly. But I feel like in the future, having this kind of information can only help us understand soils better and how we manage soils better.
I guess I can kind of get the conversation rolling a little bit too. You have tons of input variables, and like you've said over and over, it's very complicated. in terms of data intensity. But is there any one input variable or a few that you think are just going to be problematic no matter what? No, you're kind of hinting at parent material.
Yeah, parent material is related to a lot of the other properties that are important to the model, because depending on what the soil developed in, it's going to affect the hydraulic conductivity. And that was infiltration and hydraulic conductivity are two of, through the sensitivity analysis, preliminary information we've seen, those are the two biggest and most important parameters that go in the model that affect the output. And getting those dialed in will be a challenge, I think. But that's what we're seeing so far. And Zamir, if you want to, you could add something to that.
Yeah. Thank you, Philip. Yeah, I think there are two aspects to address your question about the data. One is availability, of course, but the second one is variability. So when we talk about availability, is how available it is and how easy it is to access it. And that's one question. And like Philip mentioned, case sets are a bit problematic to get because you have to measure them. And then when it comes to variability, also case set fits the bill because it's very variable. It varies from foot to foot distance. And so in that respect, some of these properties are very challenging and some are not. And also add to that part is the influence of those in the model. So the other aspect of it is, yeah, it can be challenging, but if it doesn't have a large influence into the model output, then that's okay. We can get away with certain assumptions on it. And that's what that sensitivity analysis is all about that Philip mentioned.
Thank you. Got probably time for one more before we turn it over to our second presenter, Dave Diamore.
Meyer, I think there's a question by Thorsten in the Q&A.
Okay. Oh, yeah, it just popped up. Thorsten Knappenberger asks, well, first says, this work is awesome. If I wanted to use this DHSVM model, how many man hours do you estimate are necessary to get a first model run done?
I'll let Zamir answer that one again.
That's a loaded question. And, please contact me later and then we can talk about it. But like Philip mentioned at the beginning, just like a quick sort of a short answer, it has to do with first finding the data. And then once you find the data, is curating it and standardizing it for the model output. And then running the model. And then generating the output. And then validating the output. And validation could take long because you may not have the sensors in the field. You may have some other ways to validate it, and you may not have the sensors and the data in the field to validate it. And even if you do, you have to question, okay, is it valid or not? You're predicting at a hillslope scale, you're using sensors that only measure a centimeter footprint, like Dr. Owens mentioned. So, and then you have to process the output and then interpret it. So there are all these stages that it will take a while, and it took us probably a good few years just to get to the point where we now can run it in a routine basis and just run it quickly and go through iterations like within days or within hours. And so, but getting to that stage, it takes quite a while. And as Philip said, if you're interested, you can join and we can show you the ropes and how to go from point A to point Z all the way to the end.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up with that too, is that we're really trying to make this easy. And that's our whole goal, is not just to publish a paper. We're trying to work out all the bugs, find easier ways to do it, find ways that can get it into your hands. And if you have an interest and ideas and you want to join us, absolutely, because more hands are better. And also more thoughts about how to operationalize this is better, because that's the ultimate goal, is get it where it can be used. And because it is extremely complicated, I'll tell you.
Well, that doesn't sound encouraging though. Well, so maybe just in a nutshell, what I try to do is like measure infiltration, to get like the spatial variability of infiltrability and then apply that to like a hydrologic model and look at how does irrigation affect that, and is that something we need to look into from like crop water management. But I've heard about this model, but I haven't like, it didn't pop up in my mind. So I have a PhD student that is starting to work on that. That's why I was asking how many man hours do you need to
I think we've
index,
shortcut a
but
lot of it. We've shortcut a ton of it, and I think we could get you there a lot faster than we got there, because we've identified, here's a problem, fixed it. Here's another problem, fixed it. So it's getting much closer. Starting from scratch I wouldn't recommend it, but starting with experienced users, you can get there.
Okay. Well, maybe we can have a conversation after this, and I can invite my PhD student, and she can maybe watch the recording, and she'll be all fired up. Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Great section. We will move on to our second presenter, Dave, here. I will let you introduce yourself and take it away. Thanks again for being here.
All right, let me get the presentation set up here, hopefully. There we go. Yeah, good. I guess good morning, good afternoon. It's a diverse crowd. My name is Dave Demore. I am a research soil scientist with the USDA Forest Service's Pacific Northwest Research Station. I'm based in Juneau, Alaska, and I'll be talking about, kind of where that is, but it's Southeast Alaska, the coastal rainforest realm, and I'm assisted here with my colleague Francis Biles, who is our geographer and expert in remote sensing and attempting to apply digital soil mapping models to this area. So this talk's going to be a little different. I'm really pleased that my old colleague Phillip Owens joined us, and full disclosure, you're going to hear a lot about water because Phillip and I were both steeped in an early tradition of getting pedologists, specifically soil scientists, more involved in soil moisture work through the wet soil monitoring program and other efforts. So that's going to be a theme, which maybe fits with the idea of the watershed. So this discussion, I'll call it, is going to be about aspirational, kind of goals for applying digital soil mapping to a very complex, vast terrain. And I'm going to talk a little bit about lessons learned, some things to be aware of, and how we actually had to retreat to a more iterative approach, especially with applying models like DHSVM is a great model, but it is complex. And I like to say our landscape is where models come to die. It really is difficult to capture things here. So this gives you a perspective. We are part of the biogeographic province of the Northeast Pacific's coastal temperate rainforest, kind of the classic large stature conifers, abundant moisture, lots of, forest to people ratios are very high, especially as you get into the northern part of the perhumid part of this forest in British Columbia and Southeast Alaska. Outlined there is the mega basin that we study and that we actually model. And I can talk a little bit about that, though I don't have much on that in this presentation, but it kind of is pertinent. We have modeled this enormous drainage basin, as part of our efforts to quantify material fluxes from the land into the ocean. So talk about kind of how we build those models and what to do and kind of things we're getting into. So this just gives you an indication. It's the coastal fringe into the coastal mountains and then extended island archipelagos, vast complex terrain. This area has 2,500 discrete catchments or watersheds that we've identified. And within those catchments, there are about over 800 soil map units. So that's just the area that's mapped. About 40% of this area is not mapped. Hence our attempts at digital soil mapping to expand the mapping. So I put this together because this is the way I kind of make sense of the world as a soil scientist that works a lot with aquatic ecologists and other disciplines. Essentially, we have to understand, as soil scientists, we kind of have to understand all these realms. This seminar is dealing with kind of that upper right realm, the catchment watershed area, but you really need to know where you are in this context, and the top is sort of like where you are in space, and the bottom is where you are in the processes that infuse these various spaces. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit on that middle part, upper part, but then actually moving towards those lower parts with what I believe we need to do and places we need to go. So this realm is it's a pretty amazing laboratory, because we do have actively receding glaciers, and we work on where colluvium is being deposited, right from the glacial ice, and study that incipient soil formation. And we're also able to kind of get a pretty interesting view of the landscape of what it was early on when these glaciers are treated. But this is the coastal fringing part of the landscape. The extended islands and areas have been forested and developing soils for over 10,000 years. So you quickly go from a very young, emergent landscape to a very aged area with deep histosols and complex spotosols. So it's a real challenge for trying to partition the landscape, even in preliminary ways. We still rely on the early soil mapping efforts that were done by the Forest Service, the Tongass National Forest. I should say that most of this Southeast Alaska is owned by the federal government, is the largest forest in the system. The Tongass National Forest at about 8 million hectares. And that is often what we're asked to represent as research scientists to help inform management, is how can we apply knowledge across that 8 million hectares? So you see the issue. How do we scale quickly? And we're relying on the old polygon maps, the original mapping units still to this day. We don't have good soil, digital products yet. Again, we aspire to that. Here's how we're trying to get there. So that we've been able to partition the landscape into broad groupings, broad productivity classes, as it were, mostly based on the accumulation of water, where our wetlands are at our toe slopes, down at the bottom of the valleys, intermediate productivity as you go up the hill, and then, alpine areas further up. So this is just a picture of, kind of how these systems with their national wetland inventory kind of classifications, a lot of poor fen, where you have sloping wetlands here. We can get slope wetlands up to on slopes of about 15%. So with no trees, just these step pools, and then, intermediate areas of forested wetlands, and then very robust, vigorous above ground biomass accumulation on our uplands. So about a lot of the research I did, especially looking at soil moisture patterns early on, was just to attempt to segregate these landscapes into their hydrologic classes better, to determine, how we could partition the land if we were, if we could use landform effectively in this area. And it turns out it worked pretty well. In a series of 3 replicated catinas, we had 4 slope positions identified. We were able to partition them, and pretty much find a dividing line between our lowland or wetland type systems and our upland systems at about 25 centimeters, which is good because that convenes pretty closely to the hydric soil depth limit of 30 centimeters. And so that was really, promising. And then as well, we were able to kind of measure biomass in a few projects and the depth to water on those. And there's a clear distinction in the above ground biomass accumulation and that dividing line. So there we had at least a way that we confirmed we can use these initial things, but I borrowed some of these images from our guidance from the NRCS page on digital soil mapping. So again, I said, okay, now we need to move into the future. We need to get, those polygon maps subdivided better into raster-based prediction of these soil properties. So, okay, we can take our data that we have, apply these covariates, make a map. I'm like, okay, great. We can do this. So the first step is we could get a fair amount of the way there just by simple map unit disaggregation. And if you see here, just to, on the right, it shows a little clearer. That pink line is outlining a soil complex. And so really, because of the use and management early on in the Tongass mapping, these complexes weren't divided, but often they are combinations of a somewhat poorly drained and a well-drained soil in complex. So just using landforms, landscape position, we could, segregate these as a first approximation. However, this is actually the carbon accumulation across stand regeneration. One of the key questions that we have is forest productivity and patterns of forest productivity. And like I said, these even these stands were supposed to be on similar soils. Well, the response of the stands, as you see, is incredibly variable. So obviously there's a lot more going on than what the foresters saw in these stand attributes. And in the soil surveys that followed up, clearly there were these wet and dry areas. So we need to get a better handle on, evaluating where this accumulation of water is influencing this. Across the landscape, as I showed that earlier picture, there is a pretty clear distinction where we have wet areas can be pretty clear and dry areas can be clear. And we can, we've developed a simple topographic wetness index model and a depth to water prediction. However, in the middle of that model, there's a tremendous variability that we don't have very good power prediction. So again, but with that initial, raster-based approach, what we can do is we can take what you're seeing on the left are the original soil polygons, map units with their drainage classes. You see the 1.5 and 5 from poorly drained to well-drained with the, and what we're able to do is at least get an initial distribution based on that simple map. And it works fairly well in smaller areas like this, where we have pretty good data, where we have LiDAR data. So you can now see like the distribution and the patterns, especially in that large polygon number 5, you can start to see really the variability in there and the patterns of full accumulation. So another example, and I'm giving some examples of how this kind of relates to key questions we have on the ground. In Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, there's a widespread tree decline. Yellow cedars have been impacted with snow drought. And we developed a hypothesis on this where the snow drought was actually leading to their roots that were near the surface freezing, leading to the decline and ultimate death of the trees. And you can see this aerial image of about 40% of the stand actually can decline and die, which is a huge amount of the stand. So a real concern for forestry. This is a very important cultural tree, but the tree has shallow roots because it competes much better in the wet areas of the landscape. So yellow cedar is a key kind of indicator of wet areas. The other thing about yellow cedars we discovered is that they have a really distinct nutrient dynamic where they accumulate a lot of calcium. We believe, and we have some papers coming out where we show that alters the soil nutrient cycling. So again, understanding where these stands are, how they're associated with water is really important on the landscape. We developed a model using that topographic wetness index and snow accumulation to actually show those red areas, show where yellow cedar has declined, where the existing decline. That yellow band is where we predicted that they should be protected by longer term snow area. And the blue areas are where the habitat that we predicted they would be in. So this worked pretty well. But again, we need much more resolution in this model. And again, that's where DSM can really help. Not only water, but then the attributes that are driven by water, hydromorphic soil properties, iron and aluminum transformations, again, where you have nitrogen accumulation. So one tool that my colleagues out of Monica Moskel's lab at the University of Washington we're collaborating with, we have a NASA carbon monitoring system program where we're applying what's called the wetland intrinsic potential model. And this essentially is a digital soil mapping tool. It's a random forest driven machine learning model that takes terrain derivatives and creates using a digital terrain model, predicts wetlands from training data, where we can actually see where wetlands are more prevalent to occur on the landscape. This is really important because it gets back to that idea of where those forested wetlands are, those intermediate wet areas for productivity, as well as where those yellow cedar areas are. And as you can see, the final product is a continuous raster of wetland upland probability. And this was derived from our experimental forest here, which has very good LiDAR and no disrupting factors for the LiDAR, such as roads and culverts, which I'll get to in a minute. Here's a better image of that. You can see how those green areas are the high probability wetlands, and the yellow areas are more prone to uplands. And this model is being applied across Washington State right now, and we're hoping to apply it as a wetland probability map across the whole continental US. So another issue, of course, that we get into here is that predicting carbon storage is really a soil story, especially here in Southeast Alaska and the coastal rainforest. So most of our soil, well over 50%, usually 60 to 70% of the carbon on a stand is below ground. We implemented a study to address this. Gavin McNichol was a postdoc with us, and we actually used, again, random forest digital soil map approach to take soil pedon data across British Columbia and Alaska, and we now have a predictive map of soil carbon accumulation. This is a great initial step, but it has some gaps. One area, some of the most dense carbon storage areas we have are these deep histosols. Some of these histosols can get to 4 and 5 meters deep, upwards of 6 and 7 meters in some areas. We did not have a good model for predicting depth of these areas. So this is kind of an area where we need to improve that map, hone in on these, again, these poor fens and blanket bogs to address this. So I'll go back to these categories of landscape, which we use as our hydropedologic units because they are functional kind of water processing soil units on the landscape. Again, and it gives us a really nice hydrologic gradient to examine how things are happening. Another key element of this, right, in any soil, and this gets into prediction of hydromorphic properties and hydromorphic soils, is that most soils have kind of a threshold for generation of flow. And as you can see here, these are these hydropedologic units arrayed from poorly drained to well-drained, left to right. And you can see on the y-axis is the depth to water table. And then on the x-axis is the cumulative discharge coming out in a flow gauging weir on this site. And if you notice, the fens, you have to build a water table. So you have to accumulate water very high in the profile to generate flow, and lower in the forested wetlands and lower in the uplands. So this is kind of a critical idea for like understanding not only the status of soil moisture within these units, but the generation of flow from them to, contributing areas and then our streams. So the way I portray this, in this region and maybe many other places, hydrologists in the water balance equation, Q being flow, right, runoff, P precipitation, ET evapotranspiration, essentially in an annual water balance, most modelers use just the P minus PET or derivatives thereof, and that key plus or minus delta S, the change in storage, which is generally soil moisture storage or snow storage, falls out over an annual period. Well, I'm advocating as a soil scientist, as a pedologist, looking at the implications of water flow and accumulation. Embrace your delta S. We need to understand it. I really appreciated Phillip's illustration of the fourth dimension. How does this, soil water storage change through time. That's a critical element in understanding, especially, temporal changes in soils. We like to think of the soils and indicators in soils as the long-term, expression of that water, but there's also short-term implications for changes within the soil profile. One of which is the implications of future areas. In the coastal rainforest, we do experience drought. We experience snow drought, and we experience soil moisture deficits in our soils. What are the implications for that when you get this characteristic depth to water is changing, not only for the soil itself, but the cumulative effects in the watersheds that these soils feed. Here, a big concern, the fisheries in Alaska, especially the salmon fishery, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And those salmon depend, anadromous salmon depend on freshwater streams and freshwater, supported by terrestrial habitat to, basically spawn and regenerate and go back to the ocean. All that is dependent on groundwater flow. So one of the goals, again, aspirational nature here, is to improve our models of those soil water distribution so we can look for vulnerable areas on the slopes that are supplying these. A lot of the small fry reside over winter in small seeps and backwater areas, which are really vulnerable if we don't get enough groundwater supplying that habitat. So, okay, now my lessons learned. So we do have, like I said, good LiDAR imagery in certain areas. This is our experimental forest, and those yellow dots represent soil sample sites. So constrained soil sample sites with high precision GPS fits and LiDAR. Using those, we can array a katina and basically derive slope, which is a primary driver of a lot of water flow from those soil pedons. And we can create a pretty good wetness index for this area. Now, again, that's constrained by soil pedons with well-defined locations, high precision GPS, and LiDAR data that gives you a very tight fit with the terrain. The digital terrain model is showing you the bare ground. Here are some of our challenges when we try to scale this to 8 million hectares and the greater Tongass. We do have a great repository of our early soil pedons that were done in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then some modern ones. However, a lot of these were either fixed with points on air photos, or they were redistributed by my colleague Jackie Foss from the federal building. The points were actually in the federal building in Ketchikan, and she did her best to redistribute these points out to where the soil pedons were described and sampled. And as you can see, we have some issues. On the right there, it shows a point which is on a glacier. So obviously a misapplication of the geographic position. So you can imagine what kind of havoc this would wreak when you're building a digital soil map, right? Or any kind of model. So this is one issue we're rectifying right now through some collaborations, which I'll get to at the end of the talk. The other thing is the best extended, continuous digital terrain model we have is the USGS IFSAR radar 5-meter digital terrain model. On the left, you see this 5-meter digital terrain model. On the right, you see the LiDAR image for the same area. Drastically different resolution. Really, LiDAR is the gold standard to get things. The other issue, the artifacts that we get with the IFSAR due to our very steep, humid terrain. Radar is not great, where you get steep areas with large stature vegetation and a lot of moisture. And as you can see here on the left, the digital terrain model is actually capturing those vegetation surface features. Another area that we have an issue here applying, again, this terrain model is that on the right, you can see those clear cuts that are outlined with the roads in them. On the left, the digital terrain model actually creates bathtubs, which is really a challenge for water flow. You can see it's not capturing when you get a change from the large stature vegetation to the clear cuts. You get a cliff, you get kind of holes, which are not there. That's not the bare earth. Also, in an area which we have a great interest in, modeling our river courses, especially our floodplains and alluvial and our terraces. The digital terrain model really doesn't do a great job. We need LiDAR. This is critical because we also, in Southeast Alaska, have an exogenous input of anadromous salmon that return to these streams, spawn, and bring massive amounts of nutrients. So we have to actually consider this like a fertilizer effect, and what impact is it having? However, it's not a nicely applied, generally applied fertilizer application. It's a very stochastic application. We have some studies where we know how these nutrients, will meter themselves out on these different soil surfaces. However, we can't adequately map right now these terraces and floodplains, which are the different. One is an entisol, one is a spotosol. As you might imagine, very different nutrient trajectories on those two sites. I think that this is an area that's probably interest nationwide. Getting better models using LiDAR to be able to map our terraces and floodplains is probably a high priority in a lot of areas. And finally, zooming down to the micrometer and nanometer scale. A lot of my work with collaborators is actually looking at clay development, clay mineralogy, basically soil development, weathering, looking at the differentiation from our rocks and sediments to the different clays, as well as kind of mapping the nutrient and elemental composition of those at this micrometer and nanoscale, which really is the fundamental building block when you're going up to a soil, building up to a soil profile. The elements and compounds and the distribution is driven by this. So how do we scale this nano and micrometer level, up to a digital soil map? Again, another challenge, but I think we can do it using some of the tools that we're looking at. And then, of course, even at the microbial level, how are we looking at the biological elements of this, which is a big push in our area in the soil health realm. How do we adequately capture these patterns and process of, soil differentiation, weathering, breakdown of mineral soils, transformation and transport of elements? So I'd just like to highlight, we do have a very dynamic collaboration between the Forest Service and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Three major projects we have right now is through our Alaska Soil Database work with led by Nick Jelinski and many other collaborators at the University of Minnesota. I didn't include some of the early findings of that. I'll leave that to Nick to maybe present. But really interesting soil order map for the whole state of Alaska. And again, promising, but have some issues to kind of work out. We're initiating our forest soil moisture work, which is expanding some of the work I showed. And we are moving into the modeling work, which Phillip, described with collaborators, Aaron Rooney from NRCS, again, Nick Jelinski, and my colleague Kevin McGuire, who's a hydrologic modeler from Virginia Tech. And then finally, we have an agreement with NRCS to work on some soil health initiatives, looking at some of those things I showed with Rebecca Librand at UC Davis, hoping to make some advances in soil health prediction through high resolution images of indicators in our soils. And again, a great place to do it. Our complex terrain kind of lends itself to that. So again, didn't come to you with many new tools, but some maybe just tales of using existing tools, the pitfalls and problems, and where I think we need to go, where we can go, kind of a roadmap of, before you dive in, especially to large complex areas, some of the things to really be careful of when applying, digital soil mapping procedures and processes. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dave. Impressive work and an impressive landscape. Incredible. I'll open up the floor to anyone who has any questions. While people are conjuring those up, I was just thinking, what do you think is your #1 roadblock for some of the issues you've had with the accuracy of the peat thickness mapping?
We have actually a project proposal where what we need to do is just get more measurements out on the landscape. So the only roadblock is getting more data from peat profiles. It's amazingly easy to measure the depth because we have a 1/4-inch steel rod, basically a tile probe, right, that you stick down, and we can have extensions where we can go down 5-6 meters, and you can use that, and you can hear it through the metal when it hits the sediment below the peat. It goes like butter through the peat, and then it hits the sediment. You get so. But we need to do more sort of probabilistic sampling across some landscapes, but I think we can get at that. But again, that we're probably underestimating our carbon storage because of that lack of depth by 20% in the whole region. It's a tremendous carbon reservoir. I think this was a great, kind of comparison with Phillip's work, because we could work on smaller watersheds and apply all those models, and we have done that. But again, when you work for, when you're trying to address questions that scale to much larger landscapes, how do you do that? And again, Zamir and Phillip were saying that DHSVM is an incredibly intent, to calibrate and to work at. Our colleagues in the forest soil moisture realm are using that on our experimental forests in the east, Hubbard Brook, Coweta, Furno. And it's, it's fraught with a lot of, challenges. So again, how do we bridge that, divide and, and kind of address those things?
David, if no one else is going to speak up with a question, I will. So how do you think about, okay, you're going to look at modeling your landscape and your conditions and maybe even down to your soil health. How do you think about where the results of that apply and how far you can extend them?
Yeah, what is exciting in this landscape is that, you can ask questions. You're really challenged with making things work here. So if we can make it work here in terms of these applications, like hydrologic models, right? In complex terrain, certainly applications to other forested terrain, any kind of, steep, basically coarse textured, rocky soil, right? Forested landscapes for certain. But I think in other areas too, just some of the images we can get out of our soils. There's a lot more complexity in the spotosoil profile. I think that we can use that to our advantage to really use that as a challenge course, to kind of say, how do we deal with that? I think then any tool we develop is going to be much easier applied to a mollisol profile, right? Or, it's something that's a little more uniform. So anyway, that's, I think, the benefit of developing things here. And again, the scaling. The other thing that we have going for us is that the tremendous water flow. Things happen faster. We've got a lot of biomass energy and a lot of water energy. So temporal changes happen faster on an annual basis. So we can actually see changes. I forgot to put a compelling slide in the presentation that shows redox changes. So within just a few weeks. So you will get electron transfer changes, across spates of rainfall in the soil profile. Again, understanding that basically that electron exchange is driving, right, nutrient turnover, denitrification, different, kind of physical and chemical processes, which are universal, to soils. So again, understanding them where we can see it happening in a much more rapid fashion instead of maybe on a seasonal basis, right?
Sure. Aaron's gonna figure that all out for us though, right?
We're working on it. Yeah. I think I see Colby, is your hand raised?
Yeah, Colby Brungard, New Mexico State University. I just thinking about this is really interesting work. I just was curious if Dave and you and Phillip could comment or conjecture on how hydrologic models, and for understanding a soil landscape would be applicable in a dryland environment like southern New Mexico, low elevation rangelands.
I could say that it could be used to look at the depth of wetting, which would relate to some of your accumulations of salts or carbonates potentially.
Yeah, I think in drylands, it's even more critical to understand, where that water is, its patterns. Again, that temporal pattern, right? Your change in soil moisture, especially deeper in the profile. So I think that it's a good generation of flow is even more important, in dryland landscapes, or how that's maintained. Again, that's where one of the challenges we have, and again, critical areas is pore water, right? Basically soil moisture tension. I deal a lot with water tables because it's easier to measure them, but it's more important to really understand, that hygroscopic water. I think in an area like that, you could, that would probably be really interesting to delve into even those smaller scales and how that's operating, right? There may be a lot, as we know, there's a lot more dynamic microbial activity. It might be much more robust than we even think, especially in a what you view as a, dry, much drier environment.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just was thinking about base flow. And yeah, the only time we get runoff generation here is in intense convective thunderstorms during the summer monsoon.
Mm-hmm.
So no groundwater. Well, if you go down 400 or 500 feet, you'll hit groundwater.
Yeah. I'd be really cool to look at the antecedent conditions though, and see when that gets generated, if it changes,
Thank you.
And I'd say, Colby, as we expand our work, I think we need to focus on desert environment, and it'd be fun to work with you at some point to see what we could learn, because we're really in the
Phillip,
exploring
my
phase.
apologies. I can't hear anything that's coming through, so I'm sorry. I think that might just be my system.
Okay.
Zamir, did you have a question or a comment?
Well, a comment and to Colby's question. Can you hear me, Colby?
Yes.
Okay, so to Colby's question, I mean that's very challenging, especially in dry environments, because you don't have a continuous, so to speak, profile of a soil moisture or water table or runoff, or even stream flow. So it's episodic, like Colby said, depends on convective storm or a monsoon season. So in this case, there is one file in our DHS that it's called initial state, that you set up all the boundary conditions for the model. So when we run this model, usually like it was when it was developed in the Pacific Northwest, like Phillip mentioned, they don't have this extreme dry and wet periods in Pacific Northwest. And so it's a lot easier for them to set the initial conditions and let the model run for years. And most of the time, the moisture will be there to keep it running, and the precipitation. So in this case, one thing that comes to my mind to do, knowing it from the from the under the hood, how this could run, is to prepare those initial stage files, the initial state files, and have them like ready for different periods or for different convective storms, and sort of come up with some sort of ways to use parameters based on some averages that are derived from the weather data there, and also the terrain data. And then when the storm comes, use that to start the model, so you don't have to run the model for the entire year, because like you said, if there is nothing there and the water table is 500 feet below, any model no model is going to reach that, at least this kind of a model, that it's surficial model. So that will be sort of one of my suggestions, how you can kind of overcome that.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Bob. I see a hand raised.
Yeah, well, back to Colby's dryland place, you can't discount the importance of those ephemeral water states for biologic things, like my favorite, coccidioides. They only really grow during a short period of time. Then the rest of the time, they're just waiting for another wet spell. And so those episodic, brief times where you have water movement, maybe unsaturated, maybe saturated flow, I don't know. But, even the brief periods are important for biological and chemical things as well, and moving of salts.
I think it's maybe important to point out, and Phillip and Zamir, if you want to add on, that DHSVM is one of the family of hydrologic models out there that you can apply. So there's others, VIC and Top Model, even the old standard. And so if you're getting into this realm, it's probably worth talking to practitioners like Phillip and Zamir and others, and maybe exploring what might work. Kevin, who I mentioned, was collaborating with me here. We may just try to use Top Model because there are so many fundamental questions that we need to model. That one might apply best, and then develop up to a more complex model like DHSVM. So that's important to keep in mind instead of diving right into a fairly complex, hydrologic model.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Dave. And also when Bob was talking, my wheels were spinning about these biological crusts. The longer the water stays, the more likely it could be thicker or more of it. And just this differentiation of water on the landscape, to me, could also be quantified to relate to some pedogenesis and some of the features that we see. So I think it's certainly worth exploring. And Dave, to your point, I totally agree that some of these other less sophisticated, less demanding models could have an application. And I think it's worth us exploring to see what can we glean from a model that may not be exactly quantitative, more qualitative, that could help us answer questions.
Does Felipe have the hand up there?
Yeah, I have a question for Phillip. How could you detail a little bit more about how you're implementing that parent material aspect in your model? I was not sure about how is that being done and how can we improve from whatever has been done so far.
Yeah, I'll start it and then I'll turn it over to Zamir. But in the soil input file, you have to provide some parameters, and so when we have historic maps or information that show there is a change in a parent material, we adjust the soil input parameters.
So go ahead. No, follow up. What's the question? You had to ask.
So what data you're using to input parent material into your model?
Okay.
Is it geologic maps? Is it surface map? What is it? What is in the model?
Okay. So when we say parent material, really what we mean is the properties that are derived that are a direct input. There is no such thing in the model that says parent material input. Like Phillip said, those are parameters that are derived from the parent material, and these are mostly physical properties, like we know that certain soils of certain origin, like glass or being some other materials, calcareous or some other origin, like coastal plains, they would have different physical properties, being hydraulic conductivity, the layering of the horizons, the way that the case sets progress with depth, depending on the compaction and the layering of those soils, available water holding capacity. All these parameters are really related to the parent material. And so when we say parent material, we also want to give credit to the soil survey, because soil survey has done a very great job in mapping those parent materials. I was on that other side too, and so I know that that's one of the jewels, and you can derive a lot of things in a very meaningful way, a lot of physical parameters that are an input to the model from just looking at those maps and the data and making a sort of an informed decision. And that's where the sort of the power of us as soil scientists come into play, because we're not using these models blindly and just grabbing a bunch of parameters, throwing them into it and see what comes out. We're meticulously and carefully reviewing and looking at all of them, asking the question, does it make sense for this area? What are the bounds? What are the parameters? And then we can input them into the model. So that's I don't know. I hope I answered your question, but that's where the parent material comes into
Yes,
play.
really. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, probably have time for maybe one more. But if not, thank you both so much for sharing today. We really appreciate it. It's a lot of fun stuff to think about, and it's definitely all the same things people are thinking about, but in different landscapes, and each one of those comes with different challenges. So definitely got us thinking across the landscape. The next webinar will be in a couple months. That will be macro scale pedology, continental pedology. And then also kind of tying in with what Dave was saying earlier about georeferencing some of those legacy points. There's another webinar capturing existing soil data and information, rescuing that sort of data. So that will be coming up too. I thought I saw a hand for a second there.
Yeah, sorry, that was me. I kind of had a question that built on the last bit of the conversation there, if we have another minute.
Yep, go ahead.
With regards to parent material, do you have a means to differentiate between maybe fracture versus matrix flow? Because I can see having, say basalt or, a very dense type of parent material that doesn't have, very good permeability or conductivity, but it's so fractured that that would have a large impact on how water moves through it.
That's a great question, Dan, and you're absolutely right. And we don't necessarily have a great handle on it. It's going to take some way to inform the model to know that that's there before it will get, that the predictions like we're wanting. Zamir, if you have another opinion, have at it.
Yeah, well, one quick comment here, and I like Phil said, it's a great question, and that's where the sensitivity analysis that Phillip mentioned, that unfortunately we didn't have time to present the results, comes into play, because KSAT is one of the hardest properties to measure and predict. As I said earlier, it varies within centimeters because of the preferential flow. So coming up with this sensitivity analysis and defining the boundaries and the mean or the median of those, and then testing those to see where how the model responds, would be one of the ways to address this, the sensitivity of the KSAT in particular, because it's one of the major drivers, if not the most important one.
Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you once again, everyone, and have a great rest of your week. We appreciate you. Signing off.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.